All right, back for another solo episode. This time I'm talking about skill. The setting is a little bit different because we're filming at nighttime, so this light is cooking my eyes. It's very bright. Apologies if I'm squinting. This conversation kind of comes out of a few things. So I recently recorded the start of the Hypertrophy for Powerlifters course with Declan McMichael. And in that, we talk about the ways that you get stronger, and the ways that you get stronger involve primarily coordination, which is the skill aspect, motor unit recruitment, and hypertrophy. And skill is kind of a buzzword that's bothered me for a little while because it's kind of like technical buzzwords we use to justify decisions or to almost sell an idea that no one ever really questioned you on. So that's the purpose of this episode, is to question, what the hell even is skill? What does it mean to us? And how does understanding it potentially change the way we look at training and programming? And so, again, like I want to draw the analogy of the language that we use and why we have to question it. So if I sit here and I'm like, look, technique is all about what's the strongest way, what's the safest way, what's the most efficient way to move the weight. Well, the strongest way is the safest way. The safest way is the most efficient way. The most efficient way is really important to maximize the load on the bar. Sounds really good, but no one ever stops and says, okay, define efficiency. What does efficiency actually mean in the context of lifting? Oh, it looks good. The bar path is good. That's not efficiency. Those are just like things that you're assigning the word efficiency to. What does safety mean? You can't measure safety. You can only measure the absence of injury. So we have to be asking this question. So when someone's like, oh yeah, I'm doing my tertiary bench day for skill. It's like, okay, so the skill of what? What is skill? Well, it's about technique. It's about technical refinement. Okay, so what does that mean? Why do we want that technical refinement? Well, it's obvious, right? So you can lift more. So when you're under a max weight, you can lift more weight. And so this is why it's so frustrating, because all of that sounds really good, and most people are going to eat that sort of thing up. The central theme of this conversation is going to be the fact that if we are talking skill in the context of powerlifting, load has to be implicit. Skill only means something if it's heavy. And so I don't have to say this because we should already know this. I think most reasonable powerlifting coaches and probably power lifters would agree if I said you can't improve your max squat by just practicing with the empty bar. So why is it different if it's 50%, 60%, 70%, 80%? Why does all of a sudden you add a little bit of load on the bar? Now, of course, you can change your max squat, your max bench with a small amount of load. Well, you can't. And that's not to say that you can only change it with a max load. That doesn't make any sense. But there has to be some meaningful purpose to what we're doing if we're justifying it as skill work. So that's the big thing. Skill in the context of powerlifting denotes lifting really heavy for one rep. If we can't completely justify what we're doing as counting towards that, it's not skill work. That writes off a lot of sets in most people's programs immediately. Like straight away, that writes it off. But we need to unpack it further if we're going to fully appreciate this point. So we know that you can't just do lightweight all the time and expect your technique to change. There has to be a high degree of intensity. That doesn't mean it has to be super heavy. It can be relative intensity. This is the whole point of training. This is how we create adaptation. This is how we get bigger and stronger. We push to a high relative intensity. We're pushing to the end of a set. We're going to 1 or 2 RIR or 8+ RPE. We're trying to reach that intensity because as you get closer to the higher intensity, you're mirroring what it would be like to lift really heavy. If you go to a set that's 1 RIR, 1 RIR, the next rep, that's 0 RIR, is technically your 1 rep max at that point in time. So you're very close to high percentage. So each rep you get closer to that top rep, you're mirroring more like what it would be like under a heavy weight. This is why the concept of training intensity matters. And so a technical focus has to take that into account. Another way you could mirror this is with tempo work. You can make the load harder without making it heavier by slowing it down. There are micro aspects to this that I have to point out, otherwise this conversation could be picked apart. The main thing being that certain areas of technique will have a lower intensity requirement to change. So what I mean by this is if you are trying to fix your hips on a squat, and the point at which your hips start to fall apart is like 80%. 80% load then is 100% load to your ability to maintain that position. So training close to 80% is therefore then going to have a marked effect on that area of the body, provided that you are working on changing it. So like if your breakdown happens at 80% and you do 77% and you're like, I'm fixing it, you're only fixing it if you're actually thinking about it. Like you have to do meaningful work if you're going to change it. Now, a really important part of all this, so the actual trainable quality is coordination. Skill is coordination. Just call it the same thing. It's just not quite the same, but for all intents and purposes, it's the same thing. The trainable quality is coordination. As fatigue goes up, coordination goes down. So the more fatigued you are, the less coordinated you'll be, the less output you'll have, the less meaningful that training will be. This is why benching every day won't make you bench better, because you'll be at a high rate of fatigue. Pecs are going to be one of the slowest muscles to recover. So benching every day while you can do it doesn't necessarily mean you're getting better. You're adapting to doing the same weight all the time rather than making adaptations to be bigger and stronger. This is why more isn't necessarily better. And again, we kind of inherently know this, but for some reason, we just shift the bar. We just change it. We just like, okay, it's not working, therefore our only option is to do more. That's very like toddler-based thinking. It's not, it just doesn't work. However, I will say here, just in case you don't understand why people do this, it's essentially like, think of the comment, I've tried every diet. Have you? If you talk to an expert that understands nutrition, you'll probably figure out that there are elements of what you're doing that aren't working and that there is a solution that will work. And it's kind of the same here. It's like, oh, well, we've tried this micro aspect of technique. We've tried this training style. We've tried that. Tried this setup, that setup. We've tried flat foot, up on your toes. We've tried wide grip, narrow grip. Nothing's working. I can't get better with bench. My next step is to add another day. That's not working. My next step is to add another day. People end up in these positions because they don't know how to solve the problem. That is totally fine. That is understandable. What's not totally fine, not understandable, is selling the idea that skill is something that you have to improve your skill at bench press, you have to do it every day, or to improve your skill at squats, you have to do it 4 times a week. It doesn't quite add up. So let's think about this for a second, because it's one of these things that, again, you have to just ask the question, does it actually make sense? So if we're saying, okay, you have to bench 5 days a week to improve the skill, there's a couple of assumptions here. One assumption is that it's a high skill movement. Bench press is not. None of the lifts really are. They're kind of mid-range. There's a bit of coordination required, but they're not that complicated. It's not a gymnastics trick. It's not high precision. It's not weightlifting, for example. And it's high fatigue producing. The nature of something that is, if we're talking about moving weight or trying to maximize weight, the simpler it is, the more fatigue you can create because of the fact that you can move more load. That's why weightlifters can afford to do a clean and jerk and a snatch every day or every other day, but you can't afford to squat heavy every day. And this makes sense. It makes sense in the sense of like, think of a weightlifter who can clean and jerk 180 kilos. They can probably squat high in the 200s. So it's like their output on something like a squat is much higher than what they're showcasing on the clean and jerk, even though a 180 clean and jerk is very impressive, right? So the first built-in assumption is that these are high skill movements, and they're just not. We don't have to do them every day. The next built-in assumption, which is even more ridiculous, is that if you don't bench more frequently or you don't do these lifts more frequently, you'll just magically forget how to do them. And that's so like, again, toddler thinking. Ask anyone with any reasonable amount of experience. Let's say someone who's been lifting for 5 years, lifting as in powerlifting with a refined enough technique, a consistent technique. They go on holidays for 3 weeks, maybe 6 weeks. When they come back, they can squat, bench, and deadlift just fine straight away. They might feel rusty if they haven't done much of it. They might feel like the loads are heavy. That's all fair because you've had time off training. But the actual skill of doing it's not like you've forgotten, you have to start from scratch. So the notion that you have to bench all the time to maintain some level of skill sounds nice if it's sold to you. It makes no sense whatsoever. Once you've gotten past like a year of consistent technique, the maintenance of that technique is like once a week tops, maybe once a fortnight. You don't need to do it that often. You don't magically forget how to do it. This also explains, like, if we want to unpack again coordination gains and what that actually looks like. This is what noob gains are, right? When someone starts out, they're very uncoordinated. They don't know how to, they might have a base level of strength that's reasonable, but they can't express that strength in the movement because their coordination, their skill, their technique isn't at the point where they can express it. The bottlenecks allow the power to leak or the strength to leak. This is why when you're brand new, your leg press will be miles stronger than your squat. The more experience you get, that gap will close. I know plenty of people who actually squat more than what they leg press to some degree. So like the skill builds very quickly, especially in that first year. That's what noob gains are. This is why new people might be able to say deadlift 120 for 5 reps and then fail a 132.5 kilo deadlift. It's like that shouldn't exist, but it's they reach a skill bottleneck where they can't express that technique anymore. They can train much higher intensity closer to their on-paper maxes because their on-paper maxes aren't reflective of their true strength. Their strength is bottlenecked by their skill. Beyond a year or two, that no longer happens. That's when those noob gains ends. That's when those noob gains end. And then it becomes more about, okay, now you have to build muscle. Now you need improved motor unit recruitment. That's how you're going to get stronger over time. It becomes a lot less of the skill acquisition and much more of the skill maintenance. Without going into too much detail or too much further detail, that kind of sums it up. Like it's something that irks me a little bit because I see the language used in a marketing style to convince people that they need to do stuff that they don't need to do. And then it becomes this irony of you spend so much time doing stuff that's not actually contributing to getting you bigger or stronger. You're taking away from you're taking time away from stuff that actually will. That becomes problematic. And that's where you'll get these intermediate plateaus where something has to change because what's going on is no longer working. Or worse off, you end up injured. You end up broken because you're doing too much stuff over and over and over again. I've got more to say, mainly on the fact that strength doesn't exist, which is a controversial statement. Strength is an expression of the qualities that I just mentioned before: motor unit recruitment, coordination, and hypertrophy. And that really turns the training paradigm on its head. Anyway, coming back to the heart of the chat, technique, skill, whatever you want to call it, we now recognize after this chat, okay, bench, squat, deadlift, I don't know why I just said it like that. Squat, bench, deadlift, these are not high skill movements. These are medium skill movements. Once you have the skill, you don't dramatically lose it. The skill inherently is affected by load. You don't change your squat with the empty bar, and by exactly the same token, you don't change the squat with a light 75% set of 3, where you're nowhere near high intensity and you're just quote unquote practicing technique. Even if you're doing low percentage with tempo, with pauses, whatever, it still needs to approach a relatively high intensity relative to the position you're working on, relative to the exercise you're doing or the positions you're putting yourself in. It still has to reach a relatively high intensity if it's going to have any impact on your movement overall. So you don't need to do skill days that are just fluff work when you could be doing high intensity training that's making you bigger and stronger. Feel like I'm spinning my wheels now and going around in circles, so I'm going to call it there. But that's a good, quick oversight into skill training. Hope that helped. Let me know what you want to talk about. See you soon.